What's going on, Headliner Nation? It's your boy, The Doc, and in this week's Dynasty Headliner video, we're talking all about the 10 most valuable assets in all of Dynasty. Let's jump into it. All right, before we jump into the actual players, let me first define the word value, because I think a lot of people, when they think about Dynasty value, they just look at ADP. And while ADP is important and it does give us an idea of where certain players stack up to other players, it doesn't actually give us a full picture, because ADP can be misleading when it comes to Dynasty. Just because other players are drafting this player in Dynasty startups, it does not mean that that player has the most value when it comes to your Dynasty team. There's a lot of players that have more value immediately than they do long term. And to me, Dynasty is all about projections and projecting which players are going to have the most value for the longest amount of time. Sure, there's some great players out there right now, but it doesn't mean that they're going to produce for your Dynasty team for the next 3 to 5 years. And I know we can't predict the future, but part of Dynasty is looking ahead and trying to project as much as we can. So the big things that I want to point out about this video is, first off, value does not mean ADP when it comes to this video. Will there be some overlap? Absolutely. There will definitely be overlap in the top 10 and my top 10 in terms of value, but value over time is more important than current value in this type of ranking. The other thing you need to know is that Dynasty value is directly tied to age. Older players are going to be punished for being old. And you might be like, well, they already are, but I'm telling you, in this type of value scenario, we are definitely punishing players for being outside of the peak producing years for fantasy football. Now, the other thing you need to know is that positional value matters. This video is all catered to one quarterback league settings. If I'm being realistic, if we put 2 quarterback league settings in this, it would probably be 8 or 9 quarterbacks. And that's just not a very fun video to listen to. So we're just not going to do that. We're going to talk about 1 quarterback leagues. You can talk about 2 quarterback leagues if you want to, but to me, quarterbacks are so overvalued in those leagues that they're going to carry the most value of all of the players. Now, the other thing we need to know is that stability will matter more. Situations specifically change in the NFL all of the time. So some players have a value based more on their situation than other players do. If you have a lot of stability at the head coach and quarterback position specifically, you're going to score better in this type of format. And the last thing, it's the thing that I always remind people of, is that injury histories definitely matter when it comes to Dynasty. Players that have major injuries in their history are more likely to have shorter careers and less value over time compared to their peers. So you might be asking yourself, if this is not an ADP video, then how did you actually rank all of these players? And what I did was I looked at ADP as a starting point, specifically the top 40 players in Dynasty ADP, and I ranked them all on a scale from 1 to 5 in the following categories. First up, we have production, specifically looking at the last 2 seasons. Consistency also gets you points when it comes to production. And if you've been able to hit a ceiling that is an elite fantasy producer, that is the best way to score a 5 out of 5 in the production category. The next category we looked at is age and longevity. We know that age plays a huge role when it comes to Dynasty, so younger players are going to score higher because they have more peak seasons of production left in the tank, according to historical data. If you want more on age cliffs, specifically for running backs and wide receivers, check out a few of the videos that I've done over the last month or so. The third category that we looked at is situation. And this is honestly probably the most subjective of the categories, but we're looking specifically at coaching schemes, stability at the coach and quarterback position, and overall team talent, and if the player has any direct competition for touches. So all of those play a role. They're all going to play into that situation category. The fourth category is probably the one I know the most about, and that's injury risk and durability. So we're looking at games missed, their injury history. I'm looking at my injury risk rating data, which is available in our draft guide. If you want to check that out, it's the best way to compare players apples to apples oranges to oranges when it comes to injury history and historical data. It's a system that I came up with and have used over the last 8 or 9 years to compare players from draft class to draft class and current NFL players. It's just a great system. It's one of the only places that you can find an injury system that actually gives you real numbers that you can use to compare players. But that's the fourth category. And the last category is what I'm calling market value. Now, this is all about trade value in dynasty leagues, including their hype as players, their ADP, and their perceived worth. So a little bit of subjectivity with this, but for the most part, the argument that I used when comparing players is, would I trade this player straight up for a player of similar value? And that is how I assigned that scale of 1 to 5. So players that I think you could trade straight up for are going to have very similar market values when it comes to that category. The first group we're going to talk about is the perfect scores. So these are the guys that had perfect 5 out of 5s in every single category. They are elite when it comes to dynasty value. And honestly, I don't think a lot of people are going to argue with me about these players. First up, we got Jamar Chase, Jahmyr Gibbs, Bijan Robinson, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. They were the ones that managed to get in the 5 out of 5 for every single category. They have really no flaws when you look at their profiles. They have no real injury history. They have great situations in terms of the team being built around them. They've already produced at an elite level in fantasy, and they have a lot of prime left based on their age. There's just not much to say about these guys other than they are the best of the best when it comes to value. Now, Jamar Chase actually won the tiebreak for the perfect scores. That tiebreak was based on a combination of remaining peak seasons, average career fantasy points per season, and average fantasy finish over the course of their careers. I doubt that many people are going to argue with anybody on this list specifically, and he's probably the hardest player to acquire in Dynasty right now. Of the four, I think Amon-Ra St. Brown is probably the one that will surprise the most people, but outside of Chase, he's been arguably the best fantasy asset that you can have at the wide receiver position over the last 2 years. He finished as the wide receiver 3 both of the last 2 seasons. He's had just 4 games under 12 PPR points in that span. 4 games in 2 seasons has he produced under 12 PPR points. That is actually insane. And from a consistency and production standpoint, it's just hard to argue against Amon-Ra St. Brown. I could not find a case for him not to be included in this top group. He's just now hitting his prime years at only being 25 years old. There's just not a whole lot I can say about Amon-Ra St. Brown that I haven't said already. He deserves to be in this top category. Next guy up on the list, scoring 24 out of 25 possible points, is CeeDee Lamb with the Dallas Cowboys. Now, he deserves to be in the first group by all of the major categories that I had, except for one. He's rarely hurt. He produces at an elite level, and he still has plenty of prime seasons left in the tank. So what is the problem that I have with CeeDee Lamb? You guys have probably figured it out. I don't love the situation that he's in just because there's a lot of question marks for me. You can't say that he's had consistency at the quarterback position over the last 2 years. Dak Prescott has missed major portions in 3 of the last 5 seasons. So he's got some question marks at the quarterback position, specifically his health. Combine that with a brand new head coach and the risk for a significant offensive scheme change, and it just is too difficult for me to predict what is going to happen with CeeDee Lamb. I know he's going to produce, but it's not quite the perfect situation like the guys in that top group have. And because of Dynasty being all about projections, there's just enough of a question mark for me to keep him just below that elite group in the perfect score category, but still a very, very valuable piece for any Dynasty team. All right, guys, before I jump into the next group, I want to thank our friends over at SeatGeek for sponsoring this video. Now, SeatGeek is the #1 rated ticketing app on the planet. They've got over 70,000 events to choose from. The thing I love about SeatGeek is they actually rank every single one of the seats that they sell on the site on a scale of 1 to 10. So you know how great of a seat you're going to get before you ever actually get to the venue and sit down in it. And there's just no better feeling than knowing that you've picked up a great seat for whatever you're trying to watch. We've got a great deal for you guys over at Headliner Nation. Use the code HEADLINERS and get $20 off your first purchase of seats over on the SeatGeek app. Again, $20 off when you use the code HEADLINERS over at SeatGeek. All right, this next group is the 23 out of 25 range. We've got Justin Jefferson, Devon Achane, Malik Neighbors, and Puka Nacua in those 6 through 9 spots. And honestly, I could call this group they're great players, but sometimes they get hurt or they play for the Giants group. Either way, there's not a lot that separates this group from being in the group above them. And a lot of these guys have the potential to make it up into that group at some point. But Jefferson and Puka Nacua have everything that you want, except they do have some questions in terms of who their quarterback is going to be next year. And they have health histories that just have a couple more blemishes than I would like to see compared to the top tier of group. Devon Achane probably has to be in that elite group from a production standpoint, but for some reason just does not carry the same type of value in Dynasty that I think he should, and he doesn't really compare to those top 2 guys. I don't think you can trade straight up Devon Achane for either of those guys. He's currently actually the RB5 in Dynasty ADP, falling behind those two and Saquon Barkley and Breece Hall, which was very surprising to me in terms of consensus rankings. But I think that's a mistake, because if you look at age combined with injury concerns with those players, I just don't see a reason that you should have Devon Achane below those types of guys. But I digress. I mean, I also just worry about the fact that Devon Achane is tied in some ways to the health of Tua Tagovailoa, and that is just not something that I love to project going forward. It's hard for him to stay on the field, and I worry about his concussion issues being a long-term issue for the rest of his career. Now, Malik Neighbors is a very good quarterback, or even just a decent quarterback away from being in the next tier. He's one that I think absolutely has a chance to jump up as soon as the draft this season if he can get a decent quarterback in the room with him, or if they pick somebody up in free agency. But it's hard for me to believe that a guy is already this high up the list after just 1 year, but that's what you get when you produce as a top 5 wide receiver with Daniel Jones and Tommy DeVito, and you're only 21 years old, the youngest of the players on this list. You're just going to have a ton of value when it comes to Dynasty. I would not be surprised if he is being drafted in Dynasty ahead of both Justin Jefferson and CeeDee Lamb this time next year. All right, the last group that we're going to talk about today, technically, Brian Thomas Jr. was the number 10 spot, and I told you guys I was going to do the top 10, but I feel like it's kind of unfair to not include all of the guys that scored 22 out of 25 possible points on this list. Brian Thomas Jr. did manage to win the tiebreaker, barely squeaking ahead of Drake London. If I was breaking down this group into 2 tiers, those 2 guys were significantly better in terms of the tiebreaker scores, but that's not the only score that we looked at. Overall, we're still at 22 out of 25 possible points for this whole group. Not much to say about the wide receivers in this group. All of them are young. They're all tied to good young quarterbacks, or at least decent young quarterbacks, and they should be locked in as their team's wide receiver 1 for the next 4 to 5 years. So I don't see much changing in terms of their situation. There's a few minor things that kept them out of the top tier list. None of these players really hold the same market value that the top guys do, but that could change very quickly. An injury or 2 to a top guy could see these guys skyrocket in Dynasty value. This is probably the tier that is the most acquirable in terms of Dynasty in this video. You could go try to get a hold of somebody on this list. You might have to pay up for them in Dynasty, but it could be somebody that could pay off for you down the road. I still think they hold a ton of value long-term in Dynasty. If you're starting a rebuild, these are the types of guys you need to be trading proven veterans plus a pick to try to get on your Dynasty squad, because they have a lot of left back in the tank. But perhaps the most surprising person in this group is Brock Bowers. And I'll be honest, I punished the tight end position in terms of market value and production value because they don't quite score as many fantasy points as the top wide receivers and running backs do. But still, Brock Bowers made it on this list, still made it into the top 10 technically of this list. And that just shows you how special he is as a prospect, being the tight end 1 overall in Dynasty right now at just 22 years old. Brock Bowers is going to be good for a very, very long time, and that's why he needs to be on this list. He needs to be considered one of the most valuable pieces that you can add in your Dynasty League. All right, guys, that's all I got for you this week. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, like the video, subscribe to the channel. Helps us out a ton, especially here in the off season when not as many people are talking about fantasy football. If you like this type of video where we went and looked at Dynasty from maybe a little bit of a different perspective, a little deeper perspective, let me know if you appreciated that. If it's something that you found some value in, pun intended, let me know down in the comments below. I'm actually going to pin the rest of the top 40 list that I made because I think it's interesting to look at where the rest of those players stacked up on that scale to 25. If you enjoyed it, check that out as well. But that's all I got for you guys this week, and we will see you next time.
Analytics, all the chain, all the channels.